Hi, welcome. What you're about to hear is an original story created just for this channel. Quiet, deliberate, and deeply human. I'll let it speak for itself.
His family completely ignored my 50th birthday bash. Meanwhile, they funded a luxury cruise for my ex-husband, Royce Harlan. They laughed at me, thinking I was broke and powerless. But they had no idea about my secret $2 million trust fund. That's when I opened my banking app and hid assets frozen. You won't believe what happened 24 hours later. If you're loving stories where quiet dignity turns into elegant revenge, subscribe now and stay with me because this one unfolds slowly, sharply, and with a precision that still gives me chills when I remember it years later. I'm Lydia Sterling. I turned 50 that spring in Boston, the kind of birthday that arrives heavy with memory, grace, and a strange, steady confidence you only earn after decades of swallowing disappointment politely. I had planned my celebration the way I planned my life after my divorce: tasteful, restrained, and quietly beautiful. Soft jazz humming through the living room, linen napkins folded just right, the faint scent of vanilla and lemon rising from a cake I ordered days in advance. I told myself it wasn't about attention. It was about closure, about marking survival, about honoring myself without asking permission. The house looked exactly the way I wanted it to. Warm light pooling across polished wood floors, crystal glasses catching tiny rainbows from the chandelier. I wore a simple silk dress in deep navy, the kind that whispers instead of shouts. My phone sat face down on the marble counter, silent. No buzzing, no cheerful pings, just a low hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock above the doorway, counting the minutes like it knew something I didn't. By 7 o'clock, I understood. They weren't late. They weren't coming. Royce's parents, Edmund and Florence Wade, had arrived with a curt "we'll see." His younger brother Felix had left my message on read. Irene, his sister-in-law, had reacted to the invitation with a thumbs-up emoji that felt more insulting than silence. I told myself not to check social media. I told myself to stay present. Then my phone lit up anyway, not with a message for me, but with a notification that slid across the screen like a blade. A tagged photo, a public post. Their laughter, captured mid-toast, under Caribbean sunlight. There they were on a luxury cruise deck, Royce in sunglasses, drink raised, Florence leaning into Edmund with a satisfied smile. The caption made my stomach drop. Celebrating freedom in style. Life's better when you cut dead weight. Beneath it, comments piled up, some from friends I recognized, others from strangers who enjoyed cruelty when it came prepackaged as humor. Someone wrote, "Good for you, Royce. Living your best life." Another added a laughing emoji followed by, "Guess the ex couldn't afford to join." I stood alone in my living room, the cake untouched, candles unlit, listening to my own breathing grow louder than the music. The humiliation wasn't loud or dramatic. It was precise, surgical. They hadn't just skipped my birthday. They had replaced it with a cruise that cost $25,000, funded collectively, proudly, and publicly. For my ex-husband, the man who once told me I should be grateful he stayed as long as he did. The man who believed I was surviving on scraps and sentiment. What they never understood, what I had learned to keep locked behind calm smiles and modest habits, was that my father had raised me to disappear financially. He built his wealth quietly, investing early, trusting numbers more than people. When he passed, he didn't leave noise behind. He left structure, a trust, a system. I had spent years pretending my lifestyle matched my means, letting Royce and his family believe I was fragile, dependent, and fading. Standing there with that photo glowing on my screen, I realized how deeply they had mistaken silence for weakness. I picked up my phone with hands steadier than I expected. The banking app icon sat where it always had, unassuming, blue, almost polite. I didn't open it yet. I walked to the window instead, looking out at the Boston street below, headlights streaking past like decisions already made. I thought about every dinner where Florence corrected my posture, every joke Felix made about marrying up, every time Royce rolled his eyes when I spoke about money, assuming there was none to speak of. The cake behind me began to smell too sweet, almost cloying. I turned back toward the counter, unlocked my phone, and felt a calm settle over me, cool, focused, irreversible. I hadn't planned to do anything that night, But plans, like illusions, collapse when exposed to light. As my thumb hovered over the app, a single thought cut through everything else. They paid for a cruise with money that was never truly theirs. And that was the moment I decided my 50th birthday would be remembered for something else entirely, something they would feel before they understood. What happened next didn't start with shouting or threats. It started with one silent tap that would follow them straight into the middle of the ocean. People often think divorces explode all at once, like a plate shattering on a marble floor. Mine didn't. Mine eroded, slowly, politely, with smiles, dinners, and small humiliations that were easy to dismiss if you didn't want to look too closely. When I think back now, years later, I can trace the fracture lines clearly, like cracks preserved in glass. Back then, I kept telling myself I was being dramatic. Royce encouraged that. His family perfected it. Royce and I had been married for 22 years. On paper, it looked stable, respectable. The kind of marriage people pointed to at neighborhood dinners and said, "They'll last forever." He had charm, the kind that didn't require effort, and I had discipline, the kind that never demanded applause. I handled the logistics of life. He handled being liked. For a long time, that balance fooled everyone, including me. The first time I felt truly invisible was at a holiday dinner hosted by his parents. Edmund Wade carved the turkey while Florence presided over the table like a quiet monarch. Roy sat beside me, laughing easily, telling stories that always centered him. At one point, Florence leaned toward Irene and said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Well, some people just don't have the financial instinct. They prefer comfort over ambition." Her eyes flicked toward me for half a second before drifting away. Royce squeezed my knee under the table, not in defense, but in warning. "Don't react. Don't embarrass him." After that, the comments multiplied. Felix joked about real money and real investors, always careful to frame it as teasing. Irene liked to ask pointed questions about my work, my savings, my future, each one wrapped in false concern. "Are you going to be okay on your own one day, Lydia?" she asked once, smiling sweetly. Royce laughed before I could answer. "She's fine," he said. "Lydia's low maintenance." It sounded like praise. It wasn't. The truth was, Royce never knew what I owned, and he never tried to find out. He assumed my father's inheritance had been modest. He assumed my calm meant compliance. I let him assume. When my father passed, I mourned quietly and finalized trust arrangements without discussion. I didn't lie. I just didn't volunteer information. Royce never noticed the difference between privacy and poverty. His family never questioned it. The divorce itself arrived disguised as inevitability. Royce framed it as mutual. "We've grown apart," he told people. What he meant was that I had stopped cushioning his ego. He had started spending more time with people who applauded him loudly and asked nothing in return. When I confronted him about money disappearing from our joint account, small amounts, spaced carefully, he smiled and said, "Relax. You're always so tense about finances." That was the moment something inside me went very still. After the papers were signed, his family closed ranks instantly. Florence stopped answering my messages. Edmund's tone shifted from cordial to condescending. Felix made jokes about starting fresh and cutting losses. Irene posted vague quotes online about loyalty and knowing your worth. Royce, meanwhile, discovered a new version of himself, the charming survivor, the man allegedly freed from a woman who had held him back. The narrative spread quickly. I didn't fight it. Silence again did the work. What none of them realized was that silence is only passive if you believe the other person controls the outcome. I was watching, listening, learning exactly how far they thought they could go. Each joke, each dismissive glance, each assumption about my financial fragility stacked neatly in my memory, waiting for the right moment to be weighed. The cruise didn't come out of nowhere. It was the natural conclusion of years of entitlement. They believed Royce deserved to be rewarded for leaving me. They believed funding his luxury escape was a celebration of their superiority, their unity, their power. When they laughed about me online, when they labeled me dead weight, they weren't just mocking my loneliness. They were declaring ownership over a story that never belonged to them. As I stood in my kitchen that night, phone in hand, cake untouched, I finally understood something with perfect clarity. The divorce had never been the betrayal. The betrayal was the assumption that I would always remain small, and that assumption was about to become very expensive. What they didn't know yet, what Royce certainly didn't know as he sipped his drink under Caribbean stars, was that I had already traced every financial thread tying him to me, every residual account, every overlooked clause, every mechanism quietly waiting inside a system they never bothered to understand. The app wasn't just an app. It was the surface of something much deeper, and in less than 24 hours, they would feel the shift before they could explain it. If you're still with me, stay close because the next part is where memory turns into strategy, and strategy turns into action. As the cruise ship pulled away from the dock, they thought they were sailing toward freedom. In reality, they were sailing straight into a lock I had been holding for years. The phone call came the morning after my birthday, while the cake was still sitting untouched in my refrigerator, its frosting beginning to dry at the edges. I remember the sound of the ringtone echoing through the kitchen, sharp and intrusive, like it didn't belong in my quiet space. The screen showed Royce's name. For a brief moment, I considered not answering. Silence had served me well before, but something told me this call wasn't about reconciliation. It was about performance. Royce's voice was cheerful, almost buoyant, the way it used to be when he wanted something without appearing to ask. He told me they were having a blast. He described the ocean like it was a stage set designed for his enjoyment. He laughed about the buffet, about the champagne, about how Florence kept insisting they deserved this after everything they'd been through. He never once mentioned my birthday. When I asked, calmly, if he had seen the invitations, he paused just long enough for the answer to hurt. "Oh, that," he said lightly. "You know my family. They didn't think it was a big deal. 50 isn't really exciting." I could hear voices behind him then. Laughter. Felix's unmistakable bark of amusement. Irene chiming in with something sharp and playful. Royce didn't mute the call. He wanted me to hear it. He wanted me to know where I ranked in the room. Florence's voice cut through next, unfiltered and amused. "Is that Lydia?" she asked, not bothering to hide the irritation in her tone. "Tell her we're busy. Tell her we'll celebrate when she has something worth celebrating." Felix laughed loudly after that, the sound cracking through the speaker. Someone else, Edmund, I think, added, "Some people age like fine wine, others just age." The group laughter that followed was synchronized, rehearsed, cruel in its ease. I said nothing for several seconds. Royce didn't rush to fill the silence. He enjoyed it. Finally, I asked one simple question, my voice even, almost curious. "Who paid for the cruise?" There was another pause, shorter this time. Royce chuckled. "Family," he said. "They wanted to do something nice for me. You know how it is. When you're struggling, people step up." That word struggling hung in the air between us, deliberate and false. I felt something settle in my chest then, heavy but clear. They weren't just laughing at me. They were rewriting me, turning my discretion into desperation, turning my quiet into evidence of failure. Royce went on, telling me I should focus on myself, maybe find a simpler lifestyle, maybe consider downsizing. He said it kindly, the way people do when they think they're offering wisdom from a higher place. I thanked him for calling. That seemed to confuse him. He asked if I was upset. I told him no. I told him I hoped they enjoyed the cruise. When I hung up, my reflection in the dark screen startled me. I looked composed, almost serene. It was the same expression I wore the day I signed the divorce papers. The expression people mistake for acceptance when it's actually calculation. Minutes later, messages began appearing in the family group chat. Felix sent a photo of Royce holding a cocktail, captioned, "Living proof that cutting dead weight pays off." Irene added a string of laughing emojis, followed by, "Cheers to freedom." Florence wrote, "To new beginnings and leaving burdens behind." No one tagged me directly. They didn't need to. The message was clear, public, intentional. I didn't respond. Instead, I scrolled back through the chat history, rereading months of subtle dismissals, ignored messages, patronizing advice. I noticed patterns I had once explained away. How often money came up, how often they framed generosity as superiority, how often Royce positioned himself as the one who had escaped something instead of the one who had been supported. That afternoon, I received a notification that made me smile for the first time in days. A bank alert. Not a warning. Not a problem. Just a routine update confirming balances that hadn't changed in years. Numbers, steady and patient, waiting exactly where I had left them. 2 million in carefully managed tech stock. A residual joint account tied to my former marriage. Clauses layered with precision. Authority defined clearly, legally, irrevocably. They thought the humiliation was over. They thought the laughter had landed. What they didn't realize was that the call, the jokes, the screenshots, they had given me everything I needed. Motivation sharpens decisions. Clarity accelerates action. And as the cruise ship sailed farther from shore, their voices fading into salter and music, I opened my banking app not with anger, but with focus. If you've ever been underestimated by people who thought silence meant surrender, stay with me, because the next choice I made took less than 10 seconds and changed the tone of every laugh they had shared. The moment my thumb hovered over the screen, I understood something they never would. Power doesn't announce itself. It clicks quietly. My father used to say that real power never raises its voice. I didn't understand what he meant when I was younger. Back then, power looked like loud men in expensive suits, firm handshakes, and opinions delivered as facts. My father was none of those things. He wore the same navy blazer for years, drove a sensible car long after he could have afforded anything else, and never spoke about money unless it was to warn me about people who talked about it too much. When he passed, the absence he left behind was quiet, almost polite, just like him. What he gave me, however, was anything but small. He had entered the tech world early, long before it became fashionable to brag about it. He invested when companies were still ideas scribbled on whiteboards, when volatility scared away anyone who wanted quick applause. He believed in patience, in systems that didn't rely on constant supervision, in wealth that grew while its owners slept. When he sat me down years before his death, his voice calm, his hands steady, he didn't speak in dramatic terms. He explained structures, trusts, safeguards, authority. He explained that visibility was optional, but control was not. I remember the room where that conversation happened, the smell of old books and clean paper, the way sunlight cut across the desk between us. He told me that I would be the trustee, not because he didn't trust others, but because he trusted me to remain invisible. People respect what they can measure, he said. They fear what they can't see. At the time, I nodded without fully grasping the weight of those words. Years later, standing in my kitchen with a phone in my hand, I finally did. The trust wasn't dramatic. No vaults, no secret keys, just accounts layered with intention. $2 million distributed across carefully chosen tech stock, balanced and rebalanced automatically, compounding quietly year after year. A residual joint account connected to my marriage, intentionally left accessible, intentionally overlooked. Clauses written in language so precise it bordered on poetry, granting me full authority to freeze, restrict, or release assets at my discretion. No courts, no announcements, just compliance with systems designed to respond instantly to my command. Royce never asked about it. That fact used to hurt me. Now, it felt like a gift. He assumed that because I didn't spend loudly, I didn't possess deeply. His family made the same mistake. They measured worth by consumption, by visibility, by what could be photographed and posted. They didn't understand that some forms of wealth are designed specifically to avoid attention. I had lived inside that misunderstanding for years, letting it shield me while they dismissed me. After the call, after the messages, after the laughter had finished echoing in my head, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the documents I hadn't looked at in months. Not because I needed reassurance, but because ritual matters. The language was still there, unchanged, waiting. I read every line slowly, like a vow. Trustee authority confirmed. Immediate execution clauses intact. Notifications automated. No approval required. My father had anticipated hesitation and removed it. The strange thing about holding that kind of power is how ordinary it feels once you accept it. There was no rush of adrenaline, no anger, just alignment. Everything that had been out of balance suddenly made sense. Royce's confidence, Florence's condescension, Felix's jokes, Irene's superiority. They had all been operating under the same false assumption, reinforcing it for each other. building a shared reality where I was peripheral. They never considered the possibility that I was central to mechanisms they relied on without understanding. The cruise itself became symbolic in my mind, a floating stage of entitlement. $25,000 spent to celebrate a man's escape from responsibility, funded by people who believed generosity equaled dominance. They were far from shore, far from help, far from the illusion of control they thought they possessed. And yet, they were still tethered to systems they barely acknowledged. Systems my father had taught me to master. I thought about the way Royce had smiled when he said the word struggling. About the ease with which Florence dismissed my life as unremarkable. About the group laughter that followed, unchallenged, unanimous. Power thrives on unanimity, but it collapses when even one assumption fails. They had underestimated the wrong variable. Not my patience, not my resilience, my access. That evening, I poured myself a glass of water and sat alone in the quiet. No music, no distractions. Just the faint hum of the city outside and the steady presence of numbers waiting behind a screen. I wasn't freezing assets out of spite. I was correcting an imbalance, reasserting authorship over a narrative that had been taken from me and repackaged as entertainment. If you've ever watched people grow bold because they believe you can't respond, you understand the calm that comes right before action. That calm isn't hesitation. It's precision aligning with timing. And as I picked up my phone again, the app already open, the options laid out cleanly and clearly, I realized something else my father had been right about. Systems don't care about feelings. They respond to authority. What Royce and his family didn't know yet was that authority doesn't require explanation. It doesn't negotiate. It executes. And in the next few seconds, the illusion they had been sailing on was about to encounter something solid. If you're still here, stay with me, because the next choice I made wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic, and didn't involve a single word spoken aloud. It involved a screen, a confirmation prompt, and a decision that would travel faster than any message they could send back from the middle of the ocean. My thumb hovered over the option my father had once told me I would only ever need to use once, and in that moment, I understood that restraint had never meant weakness, it had meant preparation. The screen was brighter than the room around me, its clean interface almost soothing in contrast to the weight of what I was about to do. I had opened the banking app hundreds of times before, usually without thinking, the way people flip on a light switch. That night, every icon felt deliberate. Every number carried context. I wasn't rushing. Rushing is for people who doubt themselves. I knew exactly where I was going. The trust dashboard loaded smoothly, no hesitation, no errors. $2 million distributed across carefully balanced holdings set quietly at the top, unchanged, obedient. Below it, the residual joint account glowed like an afterthought, modest by comparison, but far more important in that moment. $487,000. The number hadn't moved much since the divorce. Royce never paid attention to it. He assumed it was a remnant I clung to for nostalgia. He never asked why I kept it untouched. I tapped into the account details and scrolled slowly, reading transaction histories I already knew by heart. There were withdrawals I recognized now as rehearsal. Small enough not to trigger alarms. Familiar enough to feel justified. Charges from restaurants, hotels, gifts. Nothing extravagant. Nothing that would raise questions if anyone bothered to look. That was the problem. No one ever did. A notification banner appeared briefly at the top of the screen, a standard security reminder confirming trustee access. I smiled at that. Trustee. The word carried more weight than it sounded like it should. It wasn't ownership in the crude sense. It was authority. Permission embedded into code, written years before, waiting patiently for the moment when intention aligned with action. I tapped the menu icon and selected the option my father had once described without drama, without warning, as if he were explaining how to shut off a faucet. Asset controls. The screen shifted, presenting choices framed in neutral language. Restrict transfers. Suspend withdrawals. Freeze assets. Each option came with a brief explanation, clear and unemotional. No pop-ups asking why. No concern for feelings. Systems don't care about motives. They respond to instructions. I selected freeze assets. For a second, the app asked me to confirm, not because it doubted my authority, but because confirmation is part of design. A safeguard against accidents, not against decisions. I entered my credentials slowly, deliberately. My hands didn't shake. My pulse didn't spike. This wasn't revenge in the way movies depict it. There was no surge, no thrill, just the quiet satisfaction of alignment. The confirmation message appeared immediately. Assets frozen successfully. Effective immediately. Notifications sent to associated accounts. That was it. No fireworks. No ominous music. Just a clean acknowledgement that something irreversible had been set in motion. I locked my phone and placed it face down on the counter, exactly where it had been the night before. Except now the silence felt different. Intentional. Charged. Within minutes, my phone buzzed again. Then again. I didn't look at it. I already knew what was happening. The timing was predictable. Transactions failing. Cards declining. Payment attempts bouncing back without explanation. The cruise ship might have been moving forward, but the financial reality beneath it had just stopped cold. I poured myself another glass of water and sat at the table, listening to the muted sounds of the city outside. Somewhere far south, under artificial stars and curated luxury, people were discovering limits they didn't know existed. Limits they had assumed applied only to others. I imagined the moment Royce's card was declined at the bar. The pause. The joke he would make to cover it. The second attempt. The flicker of confusion. My phone buzzed again. This time, I glanced at the screen. Missed call. Royce. A text followed immediately. Hey, something weird is going on with the accounts. Call me. Another buzz. Florence. Then Felix. Then Irene. No one apologized. No one asked if I was okay. They didn't need explanations. They needed access. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my phone once more, not to reverse anything, but to document it. Screenshots, timestamps, confirmation notices, clean, irrefutable proof that authority had been exercised lawfully, quietly, and completely. Years of restraint crystallized into data points that told a very different story than the one they had been telling each other. What struck me most wasn't their panic. It was how quickly they reached for me once the illusion cracked. The woman they had laughed at the day before was suddenly essential, necessary, central. Power has a way of rearranging relationships without saying a word. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to reclaim control without raising your voice, stay with me because the fallout didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in waves, each one louder than the last, echoing across the distance they thought protected them. The first decline charge was just the beginning. By the time they realized what had happened, the ship was already at sea and there was no signal strong enough to undo what I had locked in place. I learned what panic sounds like through voicemails, not the dramatic kind people expect, but something thinner, tighter, edged with disbelief. The first message from Royce came through less than an hour after I froze the assets. His voice was still controlled, still wrapped in charm, but there was a crack running through it now. He said there must be a mistake. He joked about technology being unreliable. He asked if I had moved something around by accident. He didn't say please, not yet. The second message arrived 10 minutes later. The charm was gone. His voice dropped. Faster. Sharper. He said the bar had declined his card. He said the front desk couldn't process the payment for an excursion Florence had already bragged about online. He said the staff were being unhelpful, which I knew meant they were being professional. Systems don't bend for tone. They respond to status. Florence's message followed soon after, clipped and furious. She demanded to know what I had done. She said this embarrassment was unacceptable. She said people were watching. I imagined her standing at the concierge desk, spine rigid, voice tight with entitlement, insisting there had been an error. I imagined the polite smile she would have received in return, the calm explanation she would not have wanted to hear. Account restrictions. Temporary holds. Please contact your financial institution. Felix tried a different approach. His message was casual, almost friendly. He said he knew things between me and Royce were complicated, but this wasn't the time to be emotional. He suggested I fix it quickly so the trip wouldn't be ruined. Irene followed with something colder. She accused me of pettiness, of jealousy, of trying to control a situation I had already lost. None of them asked if they were mistaken. None of them asked if I was within my rights. They assumed the problem was temporary because they assumed authority still belonged to them. I didn't answer any of it. I watched the notifications stack up instead, each one more frantic than the last. Missed calls, voicemails, texts shifting in tone from confusion to irritation to urgency. Somewhere between the third and fourth attempt, Royce finally said my name the way he used to when he wanted reassurance. Soft, familiar. "Lydia," he said, "we need to talk." The cruise ship, I later learned, had docked briefly at its first island stop just as the reality set in. Charges denied. Wristbands flagged. Access quietly restricted. Staff trained to smile while delivering limits. The luxury they had been celebrating turned into a maze of polite refusals. No excursions. No specialty dining. No spa appointments. Everything suddenly required confirmation they no longer had. Florence tried to call the bank directly. She was placed on hold. When she reached someone, she was told to contact the trustee. She didn't like that word any more than Royce had. Trustee sounded too final, too official. She left me a voicemail after that, her voice trembling with something close to fear. She said this was no way to treat family. She reminded me of everything they had done for me. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so revealing. Royce sent another message then, longer this time. He said we could sort this out like adults. He said freezing accounts was extreme. He said he was humiliated. That word landed differently than all the others. Not because I felt guilty, but because it confirmed something I had already known. They weren't upset about fairness. They were upset about exposure. As the hours passed, the tone shifted again. Anger gave way to negotiation. Irene suggested we talk privately. Felix promised to smooth things over if I cooperated. Royce hinted at reconciliation, at shared history, at things that sounded like leverage but weren't anymore. Each message revealed more than the last, peeling back layers of entitlement they had never bothered to hide because they had never felt threatened. I stayed home that day. I made tea. I watched the afternoon light move across the floor. Every now and then, I checked the app. The status remained unchanged. Assets frozen. Active. Effective immediately. Systems don't get tired. They don't feel pressure. They don't reconsider because someone raises their voice on a ship surrounded by water. By evening, the messages slowed. Not because the problem was solved, but because panic exhausts itself when it finds no purchase. I knew what was happening without seeing it. The whispers among them, the blaming, the realization that the woman they had dismissed as peripheral was now the only point of resolution. If you've ever been on the other end of that realization, you know how powerful silence becomes. Not as punishment, but as structure. I wasn't ignoring them. I was letting reality finish the sentence they had started. By nightfall, the laughter from the cruise deck had vanished, and somewhere between denied charges and unanswered calls, they finally understood that this wasn't a glitch. It was a boundary they couldn't cross. I hadn't planned to make anything public. That part matters, because intention separates justice from spectacle. What changed wasn't my desire for attention, but their refusal to stop performing. Even as their access collapsed, they kept posting photos from the deck at sunset, captions about resilience, quotes about gratitude, a carefully curated illusion that nothing was wrong. Watching it felt like listening to laughter echo through a locked room. At some point, silence stops being dignity and starts becoming complicity in a lie. The idea came to me the way most clear decisions do, without drama. I was sitting at my kitchen table, phone in hand, scrolling through their latest post. Royce smiling too wide. Florence angled just right, hiding the tension in her jaw. The comments were still coming in, people cheering them on, praising their freedom, mocking the unnamed woman they had so generously discarded. I realized then that the narrative they were selling required my invisibility. As long as I stayed quiet, their version stood uncontested. I opened my gallery and selected the screenshots I had taken earlier. Confirmation messages, timestamps, clean interfaces, nothing emotional, nothing edited, just facts presented exactly as systems present them. I blurred account numbers, cropped names where appropriate, and left the rest untouched. I wasn't exposing private data. I was exposing authority. There's a difference, and it matters. I opened TikTok, an app I had used sparingly, mostly to watch cooking videos and old music clips. The upload screen felt oddly neutral, like it didn't care whether what I was about to share would disappear into nothing or ripple outward. I typed a simple caption, No embellishment, no accusation. When people fund luxury trips with money they don't control, systems eventually correct the story. I added 3 screenshots and posted. Within minutes, the views started climbing. Not exploding yet, but steady. Comments trickled in first, confused, curious. People asking what they were looking at. Someone recognized the interface. Someone else explained it in plain language. Trusty authority. Asset freeze. Immediate effect. The tone shifted quickly from confusion to fascination. There's something deeply satisfying to watch people piece together a truth on their own. An hour later, the video crossed 100,000 views. The comments multiplied faster than I could read them. Strangers sharing their own stories of being underestimated. Women my age recognizing the pattern instantly. Men admitting they had made similar assumptions and paid for them later. The algorithm did what algorithms do when they sense engagement, it widened the circle. I posted nothing else. I didn't reply to comments. I let the content speak. Meanwhile, my phone began buzzing again, but this time the calls weren't just from the cruise. Old acquaintances, distant relatives, people who had seen the video and connected dots. Some were supportive, some were nervous. A few asked quietly if the people involved were who they thought they were. I didn't confirm or deny. Ambiguity does half the work if you let it. The family group chat exploded not long after. Felix accused me of humiliating them publicly. Irene said I was trying to ruin their reputations. Florence wrote a long message about dignity, about keeping matters private, about how disappointed she was in me. Royce's messages came last, and they were different. Shorter, careful. He asked me to take the post down. He said people were talking. He said this had gone too far. I watched a view count climb past 500,000 while he typed. 700,000 by nightfall. Accounts began stitching the video, analyzing it, praising it. Someone labeled it silent revenge. Someone else called it financial karma. The language wasn't mine, but the recognition was. For years, they had controlled the story by speaking louder. Now the story was traveling without them. What struck me most wasn't the praise. It was the shift in tone directed at them. Comments appeared under their cruise photos asking why they were suddenly so quiet, why they had limited replies, why the trip looked different than advertised. People began connecting the dots publicly, tagging, speculating. The polished image cracked under the weight of curiosity. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. There's a difference. Triumph wants applause. Settlement wants balance. The video wasn't revenge. It was context. It showed that the woman they had dismissed had not only retained control, but had exercised it cleanly, legally, without shouting. That distinction resonated far beyond my own situation. Late that evening, I finally responded to Royce with a single sentence. I didn't name you. I didn't accuse you. I shared my authority. He didn't reply. The next morning, the video crossed 750,000 views. Media accounts reached out. I ignored them. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years sent messages of support. A few people apologized for believing the wrong story. I accepted those quietly. Correction doesn't need ceremony. From the cruise, the messages changed again. No more anger. No more accusations. Just urgency. Requests to talk. Promises to explain. Appeals to history. None of it mattered anymore. The public narrative had shifted, but more importantly, the private balance had already been restored. If you're still with me, understand this part clearly. Public exposure isn't about shaming. It's about removing the ability to misrepresent reality. Once that ability disappears, power recalibrates on its own. By the time the ship prepared to return to port, they weren't asking me to fix the accounts anymore, they were asking to come to my house, and that request changed everything. They arrived 2 days after the cruise docked, not together, but close enough that I could see the coordination in their timing. Royce came first, alone, standing on my front step like a man unsure whether he still recognized the house he used to live in. He wore the same jacket he favored when he wanted to appear reasonable. His smile tried to assemble itself out of habit and failed. I didn't invite him in right away. That pause mattered. It reset the hierarchy before a single word was spoken. When I did open the door fully, I didn't step back. I stood where I was, calm, composed, letting him cross the threshold only after he asked. He commented on the house, on how good it looked, as if its stability surprised him. I offered him water and nothing else. He declined, then accepted when he realized declining wasn't leverage. We sat at opposite ends of the living room, the same room where I had planned my birthday, the same room they had dismissed as irrelevant. Royce began carefully. He said things had spiraled. He said there had been misunderstandings. He said the post had caused unnecessary attention. He didn't apologize. He reframed. He suggested we resolve it privately, quietly, like adults. I let him finish. Silence again did the work. When he finally stopped talking, the absence of response unsettled him more than anger ever would have. I told him the accounts would remain frozen until I decided otherwise. Not as punishment, as correction. I explained, slowly, clearly, without emotion, that trustee authority doesn't negotiate under pressure. It operates under discretion. His eyes flicked to the hallway, to the door, to the place where Florence would soon arrive. He asked what his family had to do with it. I answered honestly, everything. Florence and Edmund arrived together, followed closely by Felix and Irene. I didn't greet them at the door. I waited until they were all inside the living room, standing, uncertain, suddenly aware that this space wasn't neutral ground. Florence spoke first, of course. She tried dignity. She talked about family, about respect, about keeping matters private. Edmund nodded along, his authority reduced to posture alone. Felix attempted humor and abandoned it halfway through when no one laughed. Irene crossed her arms and said nothing, watching, calculating. I listened to all of it. Then I placed my phone on the table between us and slid it forward. Screenshots, documents, trustee designation, dates, clauses, authority laid out cleanly, unarguable. No accusations, no commentary, just structure. I told them they had mistaken access for ownership. I told them that generosity funded with assumptions collapses the moment those assumptions are challenged. I told them that the cruise, the jokes, the posts, the laughter had clarified something I had tolerated for too long. I wasn't emotional. I wasn't raised. I was precise. That frightened them more than anger would have. Florence accused me of cruelty. I corrected her. I told her cruelty requires intent to harm. I had intent to correct misuse. Felix asked how long the freeze would last. I told him as long as necessary. Irene finally spoke then, her voice sharp, saying I was enjoying this. I shook my head. Enjoyment fades. Authority endures. Royce tried one last time. He mentioned history, marriage, the years we had shared. He asked if this was really how I wanted things to end. I told him calmly that things had ended long ago. What we were doing now was accounting. The difference mattered. I stood and indicated the door. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I simply stated that the conversation was over, that further contact would be limited and structured, that the trust would remain under my discretion, that public narratives would not be negotiated privately. They left slowly, one by one, stripped of performance, reduced to reality. After the door closed, the house felt larger, quieter, balanced. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. Some confrontations are about winning. Others are about closing a chapter so thoroughly it cannot be reopened. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to reclaim a space without shouting, this is it. No applause, no witnesses, just alignment restored. What came next wasn't about them at all, it was about what happens when you finally celebrate yourself without apology. The second celebration happened a week later, and it felt nothing like the first one I had planned. There were no linen napkins folded to impress anyone, no carefully curated guest list designed to signal worth. Instead, there was laughter that arrived early and stayed late, voices overlapping without competition, music chosen by memory instead of trend. I didn't dress to be elegant that night. I dressed to be comfortable in my own skin, and that alone changed the temperature of the room. My friends came carrying food, not expectations. They brought stories, not judgments. Women who had known me before my marriage, during it, and after it sat around my dining table like witnesses to a life fully lived, not selectively edited. Someone opened a bottle of wine without ceremony. Someone else cut the cake I had frozen after my birthday and laughed when the frosting cracked imperfectly. No one apologized for anything. No one needed to. At some point in the evening, one of them raised a glass and said, "To 50. Not as a milestone, not as a warning, but as a declaration. 50 as arrival, 50 as authority, 50 as the age where you stop explaining yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. I felt something loosen in my chest then, something that had been tight for years without my noticing. We talked about everything except them. That mattered more than I expected. The absence of their names, their drama, their entitlement felt like clean air. When someone finally asked how I was really doing, the answer surprised me with its simplicity. I said I was calm, not relieved, not vindicated. Calm. That word settled into the room like truth. Later that night, after everyone left and the dishes were stacked casually in the sink, I stood alone in the living room again. The same room, the same walls, but the energy had shifted completely. What had once felt like a stage for dismissal now felt like a place of return. I realized then that the real gift of what I had done wasn't the freeze, or the exposure, or even the confrontation. It was the reclamation of space. The trust remained intact. The assets remained frozen longer than they expected. Not forever, but long enough to reset expectations permanently. Conditions were set, boundaries formalized, access redefined, authority respected. There were no apologies from them that mattered, and that was fine. Apologies are emotional currency. I had already settled the account that counted. The video eventually stopped circulating the way viral things do. Views plateaued, comments slowed, news stories replaced it in the feed. But something else lingered quietly beneath that cycle. The recognition. From women who wrote to me privately. From men who admitted they had watched it twice. From people who didn't need details to understand the pattern. That recognition didn't fade when the algorithm moved on. Royce faded too, in the way people do when their narrative no longer finds an audience. We spoke only once more, months later, briefly, structurally, without emotion. He asked if things could ever be different. I told him they already were. That answer was enough. What I learned through all of this is something my father tried to teach me long before I needed the lesson. Wealth isn't about accumulation. It's about authorship. About deciding who gets access, under what conditions and for how long. Silence can be generosity. It can also be strategy. The difference lies in intention. Turning 50 didn't make me powerful. It revealed the power I had been carrying quietly for decades. The difference is that now, I no longer pretend it isn't there. I don't announce it. I don't perform it. I simply live in alignment with it. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own story, remember this: dignity doesn't require permission, and authority doesn't need applause. Systems exist whether people respect them or not. The moment you understand which ones answer to you, everything changes. My birthday didn't end the way I planned. It ended better, not with candles blown out in silence, but with clarity lit from within. And that, I've learned, is a kind of celebration no one else gets to ignore.